Who loves Airtable? I do. This is a live session I did on some more intermediate and advanced ways to use Airtable. It's the 7th of an 8-week live series I did for my accountant community that we're releasing for free to get you those continuing education credits without having to sit through cybersecurity or Excel training. So if you didn't catch the first one I did on Airtable, that is week 2. There's a whole playlist with all these videos and I'm probably worth checking that one out first. But I still think Airtable is no-code's killer app. Of all the tools we covered in the series, kind of surprised me. More so than Zapier, more so than RPA. Airtable came away as the one people were most pumped about, and I still hear from people. They're now active Airtable users using it every week. So without further ado, let's go deep on some Airtable. Airtable part 2. So week 2, we dug into Airtable, initially talked really more basic functionality to get a foundational understanding of how it works. Today, we are flexing some serious Airtable muscles. So digging more into, it's one thing to have that data in a structured format, but what's possible when you have it all in a structured format? And what can you build on top of that to leverage that data once you've got it in a helpful place? We hit on a lot of tech in this 8 weeks. Each of the things we talk about, I think if you're a tech forward firm, each of the things we talk about, we need to be exploring. Airtable is the one thing right now that I've come around to as I really think being the one tool that needs to be in every accountant's tool belt right now. So we're going to talk about a lot of tools. Airtable, bar none, it needs to be part of your processes. It needs to be removing manual human emailing back and forth type stuff that you do with clients. It's that good. If there's one thing that you can take out of this 8 weeks, use this, show it to your staff. It's super powerful. And I think if you're not already feeling that, by the end of this workshop, you'll be feeling that. It's really good. I'm excited about this. So we are on week 7. Next week, we'll be talking soup to nuts, from onboarding to selling it, how to just roll out a fully automated service. You guys have the tools in your tool belt to do it right now, believe it or not. This 8 weeks is a fire hose. Like, it's absolutely a fire hose. We're not going to get to the end of this 8 weeks and you be like, yep, nope, I got all this. It's all plugged in. Now it's humming and everything's good. No, the end of this 8 weeks is you've got a whole bunch of kind of tools in your tool belt now, things you have a basic understanding of. Reality is it takes time to roll that stuff out and plug it into your processes. Okay, advanced Airtable automation. Agenda today, we're going to talk about the page designer block briefly. We're going to dig a little more into formulas. We're going to talk about the button type field. And then we're going to talk about Airtable's built-in automations feature that they rolled out a couple of months ago. That is like Zapier baked into your Airtable. So lots of stuff. Let's dig in. First thing I'm going to show you is I'm just going to spin up a little example base in Airtable to talk about the page designer block. So you guys have probably seen me use the page designer block in other applications. It's super powerful. It is an app, so you have to be on a paid plan to be able to use it, but I will quickly show you how it works. So we're going to install an app and we're going to grab Page Designer. Now here's a few examples of the output of Page Designer. You've got an invoice here. You've got this little brochure that's dynamically generated. You've got a picture of a cupcake. You can use it for a lot of different things, and we're just going to kind of like touch on it from a high level, what it is, so that as you have needs like this down the road, this is the kind of thing that pops up in the back of your head and you're like, oh, I could probably use Airtable's Page Designer for this. This base could be, I don't know, what should it be? Let's say ID, auto number. Maybe this is like a staff directory. So first name, last name, and maybe just job title. Okay, so we have got 3 records now. Let's put Tina Thompson in here, sales lead, John Smith, accountant, Lisa Gregory, partner. Okay, so fundamentally what the page designer is a way for you to present all the data that's in your records here in a standardized format. So I'm gonna hit the pencil to edit this design that we're working on. And the default dimensions of your canvas are like a letter page, but this could be anything. So let's say we want to make a business card. I'm going to change the settings. You can, business card's actually one of the defaults. You can make the dimensions anything you want. So you can do custom pixels up to something way longer than a letter page. I'm just going to say business card. On the left-hand side, we've got all of the records that we just created. So ID, first name, last name, job title, and we can just drag, pull those onto the canvas here. I don't really care about the ID field because it's just a number, so I'm going to delete that one. Now, when you pull these on, you can format them. So pick your font, all sorts of options, your font weight, your font size, all of that stuff, and rearrange them however you want. And then any bit of data that you have in your base, you can use to generate these. So I'm just going to click this to go to the next record, go to the next record, etc. And then you can print this, you can save this as an image, whatever you want to do. Now, this isn't going to dazzle the socks off anybody, but the way to make things really visually appealing in here is something similar to what we talked about with scorecarding. Having a background in here that is an interesting design, and then all Airtable is doing is putting the dynamic text on top of it. This could be a letter-sized report, and then all of your Airtable records contain the actual data that populates that report. And you can generate that in an automated way for a whole bunch of your clients. Could be, maybe you want to do a customized tax summary. So you design that tax summary, you pay a designer to do a cool design. That's your background with kind of those placeholders for where the amounts go. And then the data in your Airtable drives the generation of those actual amounts in the tax return summary. A few examples to get you thinking about what you could do with this, because we're accountants. Start with the design and getting somebody to do the design for you, or borrowing that design from something that's open source, and then fill in the data rather than like flexing that creative muscle that most of us don't have. So I'm here in the Figma community. Figma is a design tool, and they have a community where there's a whole bunch of people sharing just different stuff that you could use. But here's an example. Let's say you ask your clients for testimonials, and maybe that's like a 4-question form or something, and you ask for an image of them. You could build the form in Airtable. You could design a testimonial visual like this. Maybe you put the background of this in there with the coloring of the circle in the background and all that stuff. And then the dynamic stuff that gets filled in comes from Airtable. And maybe that's how you generate images for client testimonials. A couple other examples here. I kind of like the visual design of this. I'm doing renewals right now, and they're all going out via practice ignition. They're really ugly. It's a cajillion words of text that nobody's going to read. You know, with my firm, everybody has a collection of services that they do, from tax planning 2 to quarterly prepared financials to document management 1, that sort of thing. You could design a simple, colorful visual card for each of those services with a real quick summary of what that is. And then, you know, as part of that deliverable, you're generating the visual for their unique collection of services. Maybe this is a more interesting way of presenting what is otherwise just going to be a whole load of text in the proposal. Another cool thing I've seen people do a lot is generate playing card type things. So you could do this for your team. Maybe if you've got an HR base with all of your team members in there, generate visual designs based on actual people. And then if you want to go whole hog on something fancy, this is a really cool example of a financial dashboard. A lot of us do, we've talked in the past about cash reporting that we do. For me, a good way to deliver that has been via an image, because that's easy to work with via SMS or email. You could absolutely design kind of a dashboard like this. Every record inside your Airtable base makes up the data in that dashboard, and then they're generated in a standardized way. Now, upstream from Airtable, in that case, you could have APIs plugging the data into those records so that from beginning to end, the source of that data, maybe it's the accounting system that just pulled today's bank balance, to the generation of the report itself, That's getting pulled into Airtable automatically, and then Airtable generates this really cool looking visual. So a few ideas to get you noodling, ways I've used this. So we did weekly PPP reporting for clients during the 8-week spending period. Remember that? And this is a page template we designed in Airtable that just has a bunch of variables in it that generated the reports for our clients week over week. This is another one where we were tracking the FTE and gross wage limitations by employee. And this was like an advanced package that we sold our clients. We designed this in Airtable. 90% of this visual design is the background that was designed in a design tool. And then Airtable puts the dynamic aspects of it on top. So for me, my admin team was able to generate these really fancy looking reports that had a bunch of calculations that were done automatically. But for me, it was my admin team that was able to do that because they had access to the tool, and the tool had been set up to calculate everything and generate the reports. If you're thinking, what's the difference between Page Designer and Banner Bear? Page Designer today, you cannot generate this design from the API. So it's always going to require hopping in here and printing that thing. So if it's something that you want to generate and send sight unseen, Banner Bear is probably a better option. But for us, oftentimes when we're building a visual like that, it starts in Airtable. We kind of work out the kinks, figure out how we want it to look, get it stable. And then if we're going to send it out sight unseen, we transition it to Banner Bear because then we can just hit that API and then Banner Bear sends it. So be thinking about that when you're designing visuals for people in a standardized way. In my mind, that beats the socks off of an email trying to explain something technical to your client. Okay, next, formulas. We touched on this just a bit. I'm just going to add a formula field here. Now, I think the easiest way to get our head around formulas is thinking about Excel, and it has all of those functions like you would expect from Excel, doing things with dates, summing things, if statements, that sort of thing, has all of that. But how you use formula fields, it kind of changes when you think about this database as not just a way of presenting something visually, but as the API that's backing something you may want to generate automatically. I'll give you an example. In this design, I think we eventually moved this one to Banner Bear, but you'll notice some things about this design that are dynamic. So, for example, this employee, they're FTE limited right now. And when they're FTE limited, it shows this yellow little graphic rather than the green graphic. Same thing with these numbers up here. Depending on the results of those two kind of comparison numbers, it's either going to be an upward green arrow or it's going to be a downward red arrow. Now, what we use to drive that logic is formula fields inside of Airtable. When we did the Banner Bear workshop, we set up a basic example of kind of like a current result compared to a prior result, and then it calculates the difference. If you had something like that, let's say the current result was 100, the previous result was 80 bucks. And then we wanted to generate a visual out of Banner Bear that said, okay, we're going to put like an up green arrow between those two values to make it look more dynamic. Or maybe even the background of the entire image is going to be different based on the underlying data. You can define that stuff via a formula field. So every image on the web lives at an address. So if we go to google.com, this image that it's presenting to you, it lives at a URL. So every image in a website, it has a URL that it lives at. In the same way, when we're going to generate images or reports, we can define the URL of an image that we want it to pull into that report. So that could be a picture of a person. It could be an up or a down arrow, and I'll show you how that works. It's very simple. So I've got an up arrow and a down arrow. And these are images that I created, and I'm going to upload them to an image hosting site. So I'm going to say start uploading. This is a free image hosting site. let's see here. I've got my up arrow. So I just uploaded this up arrow, and now here's the link for where this up arrow is going to live on the internet. So if I open that in a new tab, we've got the up arrow here. Now, if I want this to show an up arrow when the current value is more than the previous value, I can enter an if statement here that says if the current result is greater than the prior result, then what I want to go in there is the URL of the up arrow. If it's not, then I want it to use the URL of the down arrow. Okay, so when you're thinking about a visual design you want to use with your clients, like a tax planning visual or an S-Corp consultation, something like that, the visual that you design is probably going to have aspects of it that are dynamic. And as much as you can build the dynamic aspects of that image programmatically. So you may have very few numbers in here that are actually driving what's happening, but based on those numbers, you can set up all sorts of references to an up or a down arrow, or this yellow visual versus this green visual, that sort of thing that makes that whole visual come alive and look much more dynamic, but is still really just like 5 numbers driving its generation. So loads of ways to use that formula field from the standpoint of Airtable being your API and not just a set of numbers. Okay, so one more field I'll show you here. It's called the button field. And this one will really bake your noodles. So basically, it adds a button that you basically hook up some sort of function to the button. So these are the different actions it can take. It can open a specific URL. It can open something in Page Designer. So using that previous example, let's say we generate a bunch of stuff out of Airtable from Page Designer. You click that button, it's going to open the Page Designer, and then you can print it. You could run a script, you could preview a URL, open a custom app, lots of things here. The thing that you use this for the most, though, is calling webhooks. So we've talked about webhooks a little bit thus far. And webhooks, easiest way to think of webhooks is as simply triggers. So your Zapier processes, your Integromat processes, all of those things start with a trigger. That's how all of those follow-up actions start. There always has to be a trigger at the top of the funnel. And a webhook is kind of you bringing your own trigger to the party. So you make that trigger whatever you want it to be. Now, Zapier supports webhooks, Integromat supports webhooks. You create a webhook. So in Zapier, you say, create a new webhook, and it's a unique URL, and then you throw whatever you want at that webhook, and then it starts the process. So if I was using Zapier, I would create a webhook. I would paste the URL into this address. And then after that URL, I would tag on any other variables that I wanted to pass in to the webhook. So from this button, you can trigger anything based on this record. Now it's a little abstract, but I'll show you an example of how I use it. So Launch FA, if you're not familiar, it's like a tech discovery thing I do for accountants. It's 10 to 15 new launches every week that I think are relevant to accountants that you should be aware of. And it goes out a lot of places. It goes out to the website, goes out via newsletter, via Twitter, via Facebook. All of them have a screenshot of the actual application, stuff like that. How does all the content get built for that? I'll show you. So I'm inside of my base here that is all of the launches that have ever been shared via Launch FA. Basically what I have is a form for myself where I submit the new tools that I want to share. So I put in the name of the tool, I put in the type, whether it's like a newly launched or newly funded tool, tags like, is it tax related, that sort of thing, the link to the tool, the vendor description of what it does, and then a couple of notes that are like kind of my opinion on it. So I built this for myself. This is how I submit tools. Now, all of those come in as new records here, and I'll show you how I'm using a few of the things we've talked about. So this is a formula field. What this formula field does is it builds the HTML of that tool for the email newsletter that goes out. So this is a formula that I had designed once that pulls in all of the different variables, the title, the vendor description, the URL of the image it's going to use, all of that gets pulled in right here. And then there's another table that is all of the issues. So last Sunday, issue number 25 went out. Right here are all of the tools that were in that issue. And then this formula field rolls up all of the formula fields we just looked at, the HTML for those individual fields. I copy and paste this HTML, and that's the entire newsletter. So that formula field is building the HTML for the email. Next, we're using quite a few webhooks to build like visuals. When the tool gets sent out on Twitter, it has a visual that's a specific design and specific dimensions that are suited for Twitter. Same thing with Facebook. It's a little bit different dimensions that's suited for Facebook, shows up better on Facebook, and those are dynamically generated for each tool. Now, when we add a tool, we have to generate all these images, right? So here's one that evidently I've never posted on Facebook. It doesn't have a Facebook image. We have a Zapier process that starts with a webhook, and we call that webhook, and then Zapier goes out and tells Bannerbear to create this image from all of the things it received in the webhook. And so we can call that webhook from Airtable. And so here's the response back from Zapier. It says it was successful. We clicked that button to call the webhook and generate the Facebook image. And now you'll see the last step in that Zapier process was to come back and post that image back to Airtable. So that all just happened outside of Airtable, but we call the webhook to initiate it. So we call a webhook to Zapier. Zapier goes to Bannerbear and it says, generate this image. And then Zapier takes that image back from Bannerbear, puts it back in Airtable. That's a really hideous image. That's an awful color combination right there. So that's how it works for generating the social images. And so obviously, this is infinitely better than having to go take a screenshot of the website. But all of these things will run simply by clicking that button field, and then it generates all of those webhooks or all of those images via an external service. So now what really happens here upstream of this is the very first thing you need to do is you need to get a screenshot of the website itself. And so I'm using an API where that's all it does is take screenshots of a website. Basically, you say, I want it to load the website with kind of these pixel dimensions and then send back a screenshot. There's a dedicated API just for doing that. It costs me like a penny every 10 I generate, and that's all the API does. So in this case, the first thing I have to do is I have to generate the webhook for that tool. And so I click the button inside of Airtable. It calls that API, and then it's already returned a new screenshot of that image. Now, do I really need to go downstream and click every single one of these call webhooks to generate all of the other images too? Not really. So what I've got set up inside of Airtable is every time a new screenshot is generated, these two webhooks are called also. So it generated a new screenshot, and then it just generated both of these images again also. So do I need to do any of that stuff? I don't, because it can just get triggered when I submit a form entry. So I submit something on this form, and it triggers a screenshot to be created. When that screenshot comes back, it then triggers these two webhooks. It also generates a public link, which allows me to do link tracking, basically see how many people are clicking on those things. It actually builds a tweet. It like schedules the tweet, pushes it to the website, all of those things. And that's all happening with Airtable as your backend to manage all the data and then call all of the webhooks to make those external things happen automatically. How's that for leverage? Now, how do you get your head around this for the use case of you and your clients and your firm? Anything that's API connected, you can interface with via a webhook. Clicking on these things may be, let's say you've got an admin that enters your collections every day that come in the mail or something like that. Maybe they submit it via form. Maybe you don't want to give them access to the accounting file. This could, like if you're zero, this could post a receive money to zero for the deposits that just came in, something like that. This could trigger an email reminder to somebody. Could be anything, could be anything that you can connect via webhook, which is all of your web apps. Now, what about non-smart things like our tax software, stuff like that? Last week we talked RPA. There's ways to even trigger an RPA bot from a webhook. So RPA bots run locally, right? That's the difference with RPA bots, is they're interfacing with local programs. But if you have a helper program running locally that's listening for webhooks, you could then call that RPA bot. So for example, this could be a project management table for your tax return projects. Maybe you've got a view that's like ready for delivery or ready for review, something like that. This webhook could be to print your tax return. So you call this webhook, that RPA bot starts in a virtual machine. It prints the tax return. Maybe it then uploads it to share file, and then it adds a share file link to Airtable. So that's a secure share file link because you got to log in to get to it. No security concerns there. But can you imagine printing your tax returns from Airtable, right? That's kind of wild. Opens up a lot of possibilities for sure. This is the power of having your data in a connected system, not captive in a kind of legacy system. You compare this database to the database of your practice management system with your legacy tax suite. The only access you have to that database basically is to update client information, as opposed to that data living somewhere where you have control of it and you can do other interesting things with it. Pretty wild. I'm sure you're probably spinning a little bit at that, and that's okay. It is super badass. It's like the ultimate hub for running your stuff, right? Like it absolutely is. The question is, what's the best way to set it up? Okay, let's make something neat. So Airtable's coolest party trick, we still haven't even talked about. One of the most powerful uses of Airtable is to make more explicit and formalized things that we just do ad hoc right now. Stuff that we email back and forth with our clients about. Collecting information in a standardized way in an API-enabled system means when you get that info in, you can automatically set up the steps that happen when it comes in. Collecting info in a standardized way, not having to send those email reminders yourself, that is a huge untapped opportunity for our profession. And we're going to build a base just for making a recurring ask of a client. We'll start really basic, but you'll see by the end, you can actually build it out to be really tailored, the kind of thing that somebody would normally pay a developer thousands of dollars for. Okay, so we're going to start from scratch. And again, the premise behind this is kind of a requesting a thing. So let's call this thing requests. It can be anything, it doesn't really matter, but we're going to design this in a way where that thing could be interchangeable. It could be petty cash balance at the end of the month. It could be the amount of money that came in that day, that sort of thing. Whatever those things are, either external or internal, where somebody needs to provide it on a recurring basis. Now, what's going to derive this are automations. So in the top right here by apps, you'll see this automations option. And this is still new for Airtable. So this only came out a couple of months ago. But what it is essentially Zapier inside, self-contained inside of an Airtable base. Basically, it's made up of a trigger and then any number of actions. So pretty simple, just like Zapier, just like Integromat, it starts with a trigger and then you have any number of options thereafter. Now, it's not going to be as flexible as something like Zapier that is connected with thousands of other things. But as you're starting to build these things out, you have to be thinking of where you're headed. You don't want to be headed towards something that's an absolute mess and a monster to maintain. If you're solo and you end up with 400 zaps doing all these different things across your business, you're going to forget what happens when I do that. And then you'll do this other thing and something else will happen automatically. And it's like in Christmas Vacation where they pull the Christmas lights out of the box and it's just that giant ball of Christmas lights, there's no unwinding it at that point. So like anytime you create something, it has to be worth the administrative overhead that also just created. And keeping your automations contained within a base is a great way of doing that, because you've got this kind of hermetically sealed environment where everything that pertains to this data is happening inside the base. Let's make a recurring request sort of thing. So let's say we want somebody to give something to us every week. Could be every day, could be every month, doesn't matter. Let's just say, for example purposes, that we want them to give this to us every week. So this table is going to be things. Each record is a thing. We're going to identify these things based on the date. So let's say that since they're giving these things to us on a weekly basis, they are a week's reporting. So maybe the result of a week, total sales, total whatever. And we're always going to date that for the Saturday of that week, because maybe you're doing like weekly scorecarding for them. Now, if we want somebody to supply this thing on a recurring basis and not have to send them email reminders and give them the tools they need to do it correctly, what are all of the things that we need to build into this? I'm going to add a description app here, and we'll jot down the requirements of a tool like this. So I'm going to make a little to-do list. And okay, so people are submitting things on a recurring basis. We want to prevent them from submitting duplicate entries, prevent them from using the wrong date. If I want this every Saturday, I don't want them to give me a date that's a Friday or something like that. We want to create recurrences. So we want this to happen every week automatically, and I don't want to go in and manually create each recurrence. We want to send email reminders, and then we want to give them the ability to delete a record that they submit by mistake. So the user can delete a record. Now, when you're setting up something like this, you got to put your developer hat on and think, people are going to find ways to screw stuff up and break things. What tools can you give them to fix it yourself? Because if you send this to your client and say, here's a sweet piece of software, I'm going to charge you X dollars a month for it, you don't want them to keep coming back to you every single week needing help. So the more you can build into it that is like they can manage it themselves, the better. What are we going to ask them for every week? Let's just say it's a number. And you're going to request that via a form. Please submit a thing. They'll enter a date. We're going to make that required. And they're going to enter the number. We'll make that required. We'll turn off the branding and say, thank you for the thing. Now they're going to open this form. They can put any old date in here. So let's say they're submitting the results from last week and they're going to enter the number as well. Say submit. Okay, so now you've got a record in here that is what they just submitted. Now, how do we prevent them from submitting duplicate entries? And how do we prevent them from using the wrong date? We can do that with recurrences. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a placeholder for every input that we want them to provide, so that the only things that they can give us are the things that we actually want. And this is how you would manage recurring tasks inside of Airtable. We basically set up a sister table that's just called recurrences, and it manages all of the instances of this thing that we want to see. So going to set this up similarly, start with date, and then rather than letting somebody enter whatever date they want here, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to link to the other recurrence table. Let's call this recurrences. And then when they enter the value into the form, I'm going to make them do it via the recurrences, not via this date. So I'm going to make this required. And let's go back and add a couple previous weeks. So we'll say 12/5, 11/28, 11/21. Open up this form. And now rather than a date selector where they can put any old thing, they have to select the actual legit date options. So now they select 12/5, they can enter the number again. And it's now going to show up in our things table. I'm going to change this date ID field to simply be a formula field that points to recurrences. So I'm using the curly bracket and the name of the field to get this one to simply point to that. So the ID of this field is now just going to be whatever's in this field. Now, that's going to prevent them from submitting duplicate entries. No, that's not going to do that yet. So if they open up the form, we just submitted something for 12.5, but 12.5 is still there. So something we can do when we're linking to other tables is limiting record selection to a specific view. What we want to do is only let them pick recurrences that haven't already been provided. So we're going to create a new view here. Let's call this open, like they haven't submitted it yet. And we're going to filter it down to only those where this things record is empty because they haven't submitted anything yet. So we're going to say where things is empty. Now the only things remaining in this view are those that haven't been submitted. And we're going to change this recurrences link, limit record selection to a view, limit it to open, hit save. Now when we open our form, the only options that are going to be available are going to be those that haven't been submitted yet. So you'll see now last Saturday is no longer there. Now how to create recurrences. This is pretty cool. So I'm going to add a formula field and call it next recurrence. Formula type. You guys are going to be familiar with this because you have the same thing in Excel. I'm going to say date add. And let's say we want the next recurrence to be generated 7 days after that record, basically. So I want them to recur every single week. So it's going to look at the date field. The count is going to be 7, and then the unit is going to be days. I'm going to change the format of it because I don't really want a time. So I'm going to go to formatting and turn off the time. I don't want to worry about that. So the next recurrence of 12.5 will be on 12.12. And then we're just going to add a checkbox that indicates whether the next recurrence has been created yet. So we're going to make an automation for this. Basically, every time you hit this date, it's going to make the next instance of it. Now, these two have already been created because the subsequent recurrences are already there. Let's make a new automation from scratch. Call it next recurrence. And the trigger is going to be whenever a record enters a view. So let's make a view for all the records for which the next iteration needs to be made. So I'm going to create a grid view. Make next recurrence. And the filter is going to be that next created is empty. So next created is unchecked. And next recurrence is on or before today. So basically, if the next recurrence date is today or sooner and it hasn't been created yet, it's going to come into this view. So how can we test this? Let's change our formula so that today's the 8th, so that the next recurrence is 3 days after the date of the previous recurrence. So this now changed it to 12.8. Now we've got this record showing up in this view. So our automation is going to trigger whenever a record enters this make next recurrence view. So we're looking at the table recurrences. We want to use the make next recurrence view. We'll run a test that will grab a test record. So just grab this record right here that's already in there. You can toggle it down and see all the details. And then what do we want it to do? We want it to create a record. So we're going to say create record in the recurrences table. And then you set what you want all of the fields of that new record to be. So we want the date to be the next recurrence. Do we? We don't want it to be the next recurrence. We want it to be basically a week after the date record that it was triggered based off of. the variable that you enter into the date field here, if you hit this plus button, it's kind of like Zapier where it will show the data from all the previous steps. So if I click here, this is going to pull all the data from step 1. I say continue. Here you've got your record ID, all of the things that were in this step. Now I kind of actually just broke our next recurrence because we don't want it to recur on the 8th. We want it to recur a week after that. I'll just plug in next recurrence, say insert there. One more action that you want to do, you're going to update a record, and the record that triggered it, you want to now mark that the next one has been created. So I'm going to insert the record ID from the one that triggered it, and I'm going to update the field next created to be checked. Now checkboxes are either a 1 or a 0. And so I'm going to put a 1 in there. Say run the test, and now it disappeared out of there because it was marked as created. If I run this test, I think it'll create the next instance as of 12/8, but it's because we changed that next recurrence to be 3 days later. So basically, this just created another placeholder for that request form. So when they open up the form, now there's going to be a new date under there and they can submit that. Now, how do you do things like start triggering emails to remind them, that sort of thing? You do it via kind of all the steps that we just walked through. You're going to set up a field that's basically, when do you want to send that reminder? Maybe it's 1 day after the recurrence date if it hasn't been submitted. You create a view for that. So you create a grid view with a filter for all the parameters that you want it to meet before an email is sent. And then you just create an automation that says anytime a record enters this view, you're going to send out an email and say, hey, please remember to enter this, submit the amount via this form here. And then they get an email with a link to the form. They hopefully then submit the form. With email reminders, usually what you have is like a field that is like a date that's like a can you're kicking down the road. So your first reminder, maybe that goes out a day after the date it's supposed to be submitted. But then when you send that email, you want to save the last date that you just sent them a reminder. And then the view that's going to trigger the next reminder is going to be like that date you last sent it to them plus 2 days or something like that. So email reminders are triggered the same way as what we just dug into here. Now, one more thing. Let's say they made a mistake and they accidentally deleted or they accidentally entered something that they didn't really want to enter. You don't want them to email you every single time they want to remove that thing. That would be a massive pain. We're going to add a table here that is called thing removals. So we're just going to make this an auto number ID. And the only field I believe we need is a link to your things table. This will show all of the things that have already been submitted. So we'll create a form for this. Delete the records that are here. Add a form. Remove a thing. Make this required. Let's call this thing. Open up this form. And now they're able to pick anything they've previously submitted and say, I want to delete this actually. This was a mistake, so that I can resubmit it again. So I'm going to hit submit. Adds a record here. And now you're going to create an automation on this table so that every time a record is added here, it goes out and deletes that record from that other table. And it unmarks that recurrence as submitted, basically. So in my case, what I would do is I would give them a single form, and it's a form for submitting things on a recurring basis. And in the description up here, I would say submitted an item by mistake, delete an item, a submission here. And then I'm going to link to this form. So they now have the ability to submit things on a recurring basis, to remove something they submitted by mistake. Recurrences are going to be generated every week automatically, and it's going to follow up with them via email for anything they haven't submitted yet. That's all self-contained inside of this Airtable base. Now you could copy this, use it a whole bunch of different ways. I'll show you one more application for this exact thing that I think is really powerful. This is something I made a while back for managing time off requests. So any business with employees has this problem. They need some sort of system for managing time off requests. So here's how the base works. Just like on the previous one, you've got your things. In this case, it's requests. You've got another table that are all of the people. So you've got all the people's names, their email, and who their approver is. And they submit requests via a single request form. So they indicate who they are, what's the start date, what's the end date, any other specifics they'd like to share with the approver. So a request is added here, and inside of the Airtable automations, it then triggers the approval email to whoever that person's approver was. In this case, everybody's approver is Jim Hopper. So in that email is a link to an approver deny form. And the ID of that request is pre-filled in the form. So we've talked about that in the past. They get a form link, and there's an argument at the end of that URL that says, here's the ID of the request. And then the approver says, I'm going to approve or deny it, and here's any notes. Now, when a record is added here, another email is triggered automatically by Airtable that goes back to the requester, tells them if it was approved or not, and that's it. You've got like an entire closed loop time off request system. So what are the other things Airtable lets you build on top of that? You can have a calendar view, right? So now all of your requests can live in this calendar, and you can even sync it with a shared calendar on your domain. But what are some of the other things we just talked about that you can let the user do themselves? How about people removals? So when they submit a request form, they pick who they are from a dropdown, and that's tied to the people table. Well, you can let users add and remove people as well. So you kind of give them basically public access to this space, and they're able to manage it hopefully entirely themselves. Now take that one step further, and this I think is really interesting. Here's an admin table. Using a gallery view, you can basically make what I'm calling like an admin panel. So here's all the things that like kind of the admin of the tool needs to know. How do you get started? Here's how to add team members. Here's how to share the request link with your team members so they know where to go to complete the form. Here's how to add team members, submit requests. You can even embed the request form into your website or something like that. And then here's how to link it with your shared calendar. So this Airtable basically, you could reuse this with as many clients as you wanted to. And I think all that you would send them is the public link to the admin panel. At that point, they add and remove users themselves, and they've got a totally self-contained time off calendar. Now that's pretty cool. We use this with our clients in some more complex use cases too, where there's like double approvals, departments, department heads, that sort of thing. It's pretty easy to keep building on it. But that's something you could absolutely charge your clients for. So next time, we're going to be talking about how to build a fully automated service, soup to nuts. So a simple scorecarding system that anybody can set up. How do you sell it to your clients? How do you onboard a client to it in an automated way so that you're not creating 100 instances of the same thing? And then how do you communicate to them what they need to do to get those scorecards on an ongoing basis? Like, how do you wade into something like this without it becoming a bunch of work to you? That's a really exciting part. We're also going to spend the last 10 minutes of next week talking about what's next for Realize. So some cool announcements about stuff we've got in the works and what the next few months, what the next year is going to look like for Realize and stuff that we have to look forward to. Pretty great. Airtable keeps pushing the envelope. This tool is developing fast. A lot of cool features that have launched since I recorded this. And I've highlighted a lot of those features in my weekly tech newsletter. Check that out at subscribe.jason.cpa. If you're certified, be sure to get your continuing education credits for what you just watched. Check out the video description below. And hit like to support what it is we're doing here. Overthrowing old-timey accounting, right? That's it for this week. We got one more week left in this series where we're bringing it all together and shipping your own fully automated product offering for your firm. That one drops next week, and I'll see you then.